And I'm going to call that G star. This is the growth rate. That's what we give the current price given D1 and R. Okay. If we solve for that, since R is sum of the dividend yield plus growth rate, solving for G is not that much of an issue. So let's calculate this for JPM. Let's remember what R was, 888, price is 211. Something happened. It's called it Microsoft bottleneck. So according to this, for JP Morgan, for me to view, again, given the limitations of this case one model, for me to view JP Morgan as rightly valued or properly valued, I'm going to have to live with an assumption that they're going to grow at a rate of about 6.4% ad infinitum. For BAC, that's 6.8% or so. Now, if I believe that these being the banking corporations, they're going to pretty much grow at the same rate in the future, then the implied growth rate for Bank of America is too high. So in that sense, Bank of America is more expensive than JP Morgan. But if I believe that Bank of America is going to grow even faster than that, then that's justified. In fact, analysts make predictions of growth rates over the next 5 years. Anything beyond that would be sorcery. So for JP Morgan, under the analysis tab, they expect JP Morgan is going to grow over the next 5 years about 10%. Why? I don't know. Technically, they make more money under interest rates when interest rates are lower because they can charge you more spreads. And Bank of America, that was Bank of America. JP Morgan, only 166. So in that sense, the implied growth rate for JP Morgan is much higher than the actual expected growth rate. On the other hand, for Bank of America, implied growth rate is much lower than expected. So taking this model seriously as a means to generate trade ideas, it basically says you should buy Bank of America and short JP Morgan. Whether or not that's true is different, but assuming case one is the proper model. The main problem with case one model is it assumes that growth rate is going to be constant. Well, for a lot of corporations, that's not the case, especially growth rate of dividends. Google, since it was established in 1998, has not paid a single dollar of dividends, single dime of dividends. But I think they're going to start paying either this year or next year. Let's actually find out. Yeah, they're expected to pay 80 cents a share next year. But last year they paid nothing. But if I was teaching this class 10 years ago, and I did teach this class 10 years ago, and I asked somebody, what is the expected dividend for growth in 10, dividend for Google in 10 years? The best answer probably would have been a zero, given that they have not paid anything until that time. That means the constant growth model is completely useless for a company like Google. In fact, it's probably not a bad assumption to think that Google's dividend growth rate is going to be much, much higher than proper discount rate for a few more years, then it may settle down. All companies have kind of a cycle of life, cycle of growth. Companies, especially companies that start with some sort of innovation, they grow at super rates initially, but eventually gravity takes over as you get bigger and bigger. Growing at those rates are not tenable anymore. Think about Ford Motor Company in 1925. Henry Ford came up with the assembly line, and they came up with Model T, Model A. It was selling like nobody's business. I think you could buy a Model T for $500 those days. Of course, that 500 is a lot more now. Let's see. That 500 is about $9,000 now. Okay, still cheap, but there was no electronics whatsoever in the cars of those days. It was all mechanical. So we're gonna start our case two, and we're gonna call this the and the working assumption is that we forecast dividends for 3 years, and after that we assume, predict a constant rate of growth, which I'm going to call G2, In the second stage, if you work out the formula, value now is going to be present values of forecasted dividends for 3 years plus the value we can attach to the company after 3 years. That's called the terminal value or continuation value, and present value of that as well. But remember, let's say T is 5. I'm going to forecast the dividends based on 5 years. For example, I could use the 5-year growth rate as kind of an method to do it. And after 5 years, I'm going to assume they're going to grow at 5%. At the end of year 5, let's see how this company looks like. It looks like a company that's going to pay a dividend in year 6, but after that, it's going to grow at a constant rate. Do we know how to value such a company? Yes. After year 5, if I transport myself to the end of year 5,